All right, guys, I'm gonna keep this background up. I think I like it. So yesterday we did the middle part of chapter 5. Buck is pulling Mercedes and Hal and the other guy and Charles, and they're inept and they didn't bring enough food, and now the dogs are starving and several of them have already died. So we're gonna pick up from there. And through it all, Buck staggered along at the head of the team as in a nightmare. He pulled when he could. When he could no longer pull, he fell down and remained till blows from whip or club drove him to his feet again. All the stiffness and gloss had gone out of his beautiful fur coat. The hair hung down, limp and draggled, or matted with dried blood where Hal's club had bruised him. His muscles had wasted away to knotty strings, and the flesh pads had disappeared, so that each rib and every bone in his frame were outlined cleanly through the loose hide that was wrinkled in folds of emptiness. It was heartbreaking. Only Buck's heart was unbreakable. The man in the red sweater had proved that. As it was with Buck, so it was with his mates. They were perambulating skeletons. Perambulating skeletons. That's an SAT word. They were 7 altogether, including him. In their very great misery, they had become insensible to the bite of the lash or the bruise of the club. The pain of the beatings was dull and distant, just as the things their eyes saw and their ears heard seemed dull and distant. They were not half living or quarter living. They were simply so many bags of bones in which sparks of life fluttered faintly. When a halt was made, they dropped down in the traces like dead dogs, and the spark dimmed and paled and seemed to go out. And when the club or whip fell upon them, the spark fluttered feebly up, and they tottered to their feet and staggered on. There came a day when Billy, the good-natured, fell and could not rise. Hal had traded off his revolver, so he took the axe and knocked Billy on the head as he lay in the traces. Then cut the carcass out of the harness and dragged it to one side. Buck saw and his mate saw, and they knew what this thing was very close to them. On the next day, Kuna went, and but 5 of them remained. Joe, too far gone to be malignant, Pike, crippled and limping, only half conscious, and not conscious enough longer to maligner. Solex, the one-eyed, still faithful to this toil of trace and trail, and mournful in that he had so little strength with which to pull. Teak, who had not traveled so far that winter, and who was not now beaten more than the others because he was fresher. And Buck, still at the head of the team, but no longer enforcing discipline or striving to enforce it. Blind with weakness half the time and keeping the trail by the loom of it by the dim feel of his feet. It was beautiful spring weather, but neither dogs nor humans were aware of it. Each day the sun rose earlier and set later. It was dawn by 3 in the morning, and twilight lingered till 9 at night. The whole long day was a blaze of sunshine. The ghostly winter silence had given way to the great spring murmur of awakening life. The murmur arose from all the land, fraught with the joy of living. It came from the things that lived and moved again, things which had been as dead and which had not moved during the long months of frost. The sap was rising in the pines. The willows and aspens were bursting with young buds. Shrubs and vines were putting on fresh garbs of green. Crickets sang in the nights, and in the days all manner of creeping, crawling things rustled forth into the sun. Partridges and woodpeckers were booming and knocking in the forest. Squirrels were chattering, birds singing, and overhead honked the wild fowl, driving up from the south in cunning wedges that split the air. From every hill slope came the trickle of running water, the music of unseen fountains. All things were thawing, bending, snapping. The Yukon was straining to break loose the ice that bound it down. It ate away from beneath. The sun ate from above. Air holes formed, fissures sprang and spread apart, while thin sections of ice fell through bodily into the river. And amid all this bursting, rending, throbbing of awakening life, under the blazing sun and through the soft sighing breezes, little wayfarers to death straggled the 2 men, the woman, and the huskies. With the dogs falling, Mercedes wept and riding. Sorry, didn't read that right. With the dogs falling, Mercedes weeping and riding, Hal swearing innocuously, and Charles' eyes wistfully watering, they staggered into John Thornton's camp at the mouth of White River. When they halted, the dogs dropped down as they had all been struck dead. Mercedes dried her eyes and looked at John Thornton. Charles sat down on a log to rest. He sat down very slowly and painstakingly because of his great stiffness. Hal did the talking. John Thornton was whittling the last touches of his axe handle when he had made from a stick of birch. He whittled and listened, gave monosyllabic replies, and when he was asked, terse advice. He knew the breed, and he gave his advice in the certainty that it would not be followed. They told us up above that the bottom was dropping out of the trail and that the best thing for us to do was to lay over, Hal said in response to Thornton's warning to take no more chances on the rotting ice. They told us we couldn't make White River, and here we are. This last was a sneering ring of triumph in it. And they told you true, John Thornton answered. The bottom's likely to drop out at any moment. Only fools with the blind luck of fools could have made it. I tell you straight, I wouldn't risk my carcass on that ice for all the gold in Alaska. That's because you're not a fool, I suppose, said Al. All the same, we'll go on to Dawson. He uncoiled his whip. Get up there, Buck. Hi, get up there. Mush on. Thornton went on whittling. It was idle, he knew, to get between a fool and his folly, while 2 or 3 fools, more or less, would not alter the scheme of things. But the team did not get up at the command. It had long since passed into the stage where blows were required to rouse it. The whip flashed out here and there on their merciless errands. John Thornton compressed his lips. Sol-leks was the first to crawl to his feet. Teek followed. John came next, yelping with pain. Pike made painful efforts. Twice he fell over, then half up, and on the 3rd attempt managed to rise. Buck made no effort. He lay quietly there where he had fallen. The lash bit into him again and again, but he never whined nor struggled. Several times Thornton started as though to speak, but changed his mind. A moisture came into his eyes, and as the whipping continued, he arose and walked irresolutely up and down. This was the first time Buck had failed, in itself a sufficient reason to drive Hal into a rage. He exchanged the whip for the customary club. Buck refused to move under the rain of heavier blows which now fell upon him. Like his mates, he was barely able to get up, but unlike them, he had made up his mind not to get up. He had a vague feeling of impending doom. This had been strong upon him when he pulled into the blank, and it had not departed from him. What of the thin and rotting ice he had felt under his feet all day? It seemed that he sensed disaster coming at hand, out there ahead on the ice where his master was trying to drive them. He refused to stir. So greatly had he suffered, and so far gone was he, that the blows did not hurt much. And as they continued to fall upon him, the spark of life within flickered and went down. It was nearly out. He felt strangely numb. As though from a great distance he was aware that he was being beaten. The last sensations of pain left him. He no longer felt anything. Though very faintly, he could hear the impact of the club upon his body. But it was no longer his body, it seemed so far away. And then suddenly, without warning, uttering a cry that was inarticulate and more like the cry of an animal, John Thornton sprang upon the man who wielded the club. Hal was hurled backwards as though struck by a falling tree. Mercedes screamed. Charles looked on wistfully, wiping his watery eyes, but did not get up because of his stiffness. John Thornton stood over Buck, struggling to control himself, too convulsed with rage to speak. If you strike that dog again, I will kill you, he at last managed to say with a choking voice. It's my dog, Hal replied, wiping the blood from his mouth as he came back. Get out of my way or I'll fix you. I'm going to Dawson. Thornton stood between him and Buck and evinced no intention of getting out of the way. Hal drew his long hunting knife. Mercedes screamed, cried, laughed, and manifested the chaotic abandonment of hysteria. Thornton rapped Hal's knuckles with the axe handle, knocking the knife to the ground. He rapped his knuckles again as he tried to pick it up. Then he stooped, picked it up himself, and with two strokes cut Buck's traces. Hal had no fight left in him. Besides, his hands were full with his sister, or his arms rather, while Buck was too near dead to be of further use in hauling the sled. A few minutes later, they pulled out from the bank and down the river. Buck heard them go and raised his head to see. Pike was leading. Solex was on the wheel, and between were Joe and Teak. They were limping and staggering. Mercedes was riding the loaded sled, Hal guiding at the G-pole, and Charles stumbling along in the rear. As Buck watched them, Thornton knelt beside him with rough, kindly hands, searched for broken bones. But by the time his search has disclosed nothing more than many bruises and a state of terrible starvation. The sled was a quarter-mile away. Dog and man watched it crawl along over the ice. Suddenly, they saw its back end drop down as into a rut, and the G-pole, with Hal clinging to it, jerked into the air. Mercedes' scream came into their ears. They saw Charles turn and make one step to run back, and then a whole section of ice gave way, and dogs and humans disappeared. A yawning hole was all there was to be seen. The bottom had dropped out of the trail. John Thornton and Buck looked at each other. "You poor devil," said John Thornton, and Buck licked his hand. All right, that's the end of chapter 5. We'll see you guys tomorrow. Have a great day.